Well, we're celebrating this weekend the core or the essence of the Christian faith. And we've obviously been worshiping God along that theme as well, in terms of his death, which we celebrated Good Friday, and his resurrection, which we're celebrating today. The difficulty always is with a topic like this is that if you've been a Christian for any length of time, it's become very familiar. But that doesn't take away from its significance in any way. When we remember again that Jesus died in our place so that we don't have to. He paid in full any penalty we ever owed. And then, of course, he didn't stay dead, but he rose from the grave on the third day. The resurrection of Jesus is the truth, or certainly the primary truth that sets it apart, or a primary truth, maybe I should be more correct, a primary truth that sets it apart from any other religion. There's no other religious teacher or leader that ever rose from the dead and ascended up to heaven after that. The resurrection has huge effect on us in our lives today if we really believe that. It has great implications for our present lives and has great implications, obviously, for our future resurrection, and in fact really secured that for us. And so I'm going to talk today about, I'm just going to call my topic, resurrection, our solid hope. Let me begin by talking about Jesus' promise of the resurrection, specifically to his disciples. It's interesting, and Mark already alluded to this in his introduction this morning, it's interesting that Jesus explained to his disciples a number of times, here's what's going to happen. I'm heading to Jerusalem, I'm going to be brought to trial, they're going to do all kinds of things to me, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die, but I want you to know I'm going to be raised on the third day. Let me give you at least a couple of scriptures that talk about that. Matthew 16:21, it says, "From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and on the third day raised to life." It's very interesting that he says, from that time on, he started explaining to them. In other words, it was something that he kept telling them, you guys, I want you to know, this is what's going to happen. And of course, Peter's response, I shouldn't say of course, but we've heard that, but in the very next verse, Peter's response is, no way, Lord, you're not going to do that. Never. And the only thing that Peter could hear was the suffering and the death that was going to be happening to Jesus. He could not hear the whole thing of being raised on the third day. Jesus communicated this on numerous other occasions. Matthew 17:22-23, when they came together in Galilee, and by the way, I just chose some of the Matthew passages just to show that it happened a number of times. When they came together in Galilee, he said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the third day he will be raised to life." And the disciples were filled with grief. Another passage, and I'm not going to read it, but it underscores exactly the same thing in Matthew chapter 20, 17-19. We don't know how many times Jesus explained this to them, but we know that it says, from that time on, he began to explain to them, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to die. Prior to that, I'm going to suffer. Leaders of our people are going to arrest me, and this is what's going to happen. But I want you to know, on the third day, I'm going to rise from the dead. In their minds, the Messiah should not die. In their minds, as they saw the prophecies of the Old Testament, they said, no way, this can't happen. They had clearly heard that Jesus would be killed. They got that one, but somehow, when Jesus said that he would rise from the dead, they could not hear it. It just wasn't even in their grid. And in fact, when Jesus actually did die, and then on the third day after his death, they weren't waiting for, how's he going to appear? Somehow it wasn't even there for them. Luke chapter 24, verse 1, It says on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. These were women who were along with the disciples all the time. They had heard the things Jesus said. What were they going to do? They got spices. Why? To make sure that Jesus really had a proper burial. And so they were going to the tomb for the very purpose of, let's make sure that his body is properly embalmed. And so there was nothing in their minds at all about him being raised from the dead. And so they head to the tomb. There's no expectation. There's no hope. Upon seeing two angels at the tomb, in Luke chapter 24, verses 5 to 8, it says, in their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, this is the part that Mark already read, why do you look for the living among the dead? What are you doing in the graveyard if you're coming for someone who's alive? Well, they weren't coming for someone who was alive. He is not here. He has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee? The Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again. Then they remembered his words. This whole thing I'm describing was true of all of Jesus' followers. It says that the women went and told the others what they had encountered. We saw an angel. They told us Jesus is alive. But in verse 11 of Luke 24 it says, but they did not believe the women, because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Going on in that same chapter in verse 21, it talks about two disciples that were on their road to Emmaus. They still didn't believe that Jesus had risen from the dead. They'd already heard from the women. Hey, we saw these angels and his body's not there. It's interesting that again, they'd heard what Jesus had said previously. They'd already heard from the women, as I indicated. It says in that passage, if I read all the verses, it says that their faces were downcast. And they're walking on the road to Emmaus and going, oh my goodness. And this guy comes up to them and starts walking with them. And they're not even looking at him. And it's like, and he says, well, what's the problem? You mean you haven't heard? Jesus, the one that we had all our hope in, he died, he got killed. And not only that, some of our women went to the tomb and his body isn't there now. And they say they met some angels, and the angels say he's been risen from the dead, and now it's the third day, They're saying all these things. And Jesus finally says, you guys are so slow of heart to believe. You don't get it, do you? And Jesus starts to go through the Old Testament with them. Just starts giving them all these prophecies of what was supposed to happen. And it wasn't until they were eating together and Jesus was breaking the bread and went, oh my goodness, you're Jesus. We've been telling Jesus about how downcast we are, how depressed we are, because the one that we'd put all our hope in died. And Jesus is like, don't you get it? Don't you remember? It's interesting that even Jesus' enemies heard that Jesus would rise on the third day. The very guys that put him on the cross. In Matthew 27, 62 to 64, the next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees, notice, this is not the followers of Jesus, the chief priests and the Pharisees go to Pilate and they say, sir, they said, we remember that while he was still alive, the deceiver said, after 3 days I will rise again. They heard it. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that it has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first. By the way, the very thing we're describing right now is one of the biggest proofs of the resurrection. Because the disciples' lives, you see what they're like here. Their hopes are completely dashed. There was nothing within them to think, hey, let's try to find a way to convince people that he did rise from the dead. Let's go, we'll get a whole bunch of guys and push that big stone away, and then we'll go steal his body, and then we'll just tell everybody that he's risen from the dead. It wasn't even in their minds. They weren't even thinking about the idea that he should be raised from the dead. They had absolutely no anticipation of that, even though Jesus has said it numerous times. And then when they finally do see him, their lives are so drastically changed that they can't shut up about it. In the book of Acts, we read that they went everywhere telling people that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And they were willing to suffer, however, because of that truth. And if they had made up the truth, I don't know about you, but I'd go, sorry, I was just kidding. You wouldn't keep standing on that truth to your death if you didn't know that you had seen him raised from the dead. And so, one of my questions for all of us, of course we can look at the disciples and go, what's with you guys? How come you didn't get it? My question for us is, do you believe the promise of resurrection? Do you really believe it? If the disciples had believed what Jesus had said, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die, and on the third day, though, I'm going to be raised from the dead. If they had believed, yes, they would have gone through real difficulty seeing the things happen to Jesus that happened, for sure. Absolutely. That would be true of any of us. Who would want to see someone that you're closest to go through something like that? But they would have had hope. They would have totally looked forward with anticipation to the third day after the events of his death happened. And so one of the things that I believe we need to look at in our lives, we all go through some kinds of difficulties at different points. But sometimes we're like the disciples. We can't anticipate that God will actually bring us through those things, that God will actually do something more, that those circumstances aren't the end, that whatever difficulty we go through, those are never the end. Even if they result in death, those are not the end. Friday, for Jesus, was not the end. The best was still to come. And if I could just say, with us celebrating Regine's celebration, having a celebration of life for Regine here tomorrow, Regine dying is not the end. As difficult as it is, and I'm by no means minimizing that for especially her kids, for Ethan and Elsa, wherever you are today. In no way do I minimize that. For those who are closest to her, by no means do I minimize that. But it wasn't the end. For Neil Allenbrand, right now, pastor of the Nazarene Church, if he dies, we're praying for him to be healed, but if he dies, it's not the end. It's not defeat. And so one of my questions is, this whole thing, do we really believe in the resurrection? Do we believe in the implications of Jesus' resurrection now? And I'll talk about that a bit more in just a bit, but Jesus' resurrection brought us life. Do we believe that in the now? The disciples heard it. They heard it. They heard what he said. but it didn't grab them in a way that it affected how they responded and how they acted when it came down to the wire. Do we believe in our future resurrection? I believe, if we believe that, that it totally affects how we live life in the here and now. And so let me just talk a little bit about those things in terms of living in the light of the resurrection. Let me talk first about our own bodily resurrection. Jesus' resurrection guarantees our own if we're followers of Jesus. If we believe this, if we believe in our own bodily future resurrection, one of the things that it will do for all of us, according to Scripture, is it will cause us to want to invest in the future. It's very interesting, Paul, actually it amazes me some of the heresies that were going on in the early church. I go, man, I'm glad we don't have to deal with some of those things. The Corinthian church was one of the primary ones that had some of the worst. And one of those was that the resurrection had already happened. Sorry, guys, you're left, And so Paul writes 1 Corinthians 15 to say, no, it has not happened. This is what it's going to look like. So he spends all of 1 Corinthians chapter 15 talking about the resurrection that is to come for all of us. And I don't have time to go through all of that, but I just want to mention how he ends up at the very end of 1 Corinthians 15. Verse 58, he says, therefore, having talked about our own future bodily resurrection, therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. If we believe in the future resurrection, our response will be what Paul talks about. We'll realize that anything that we do in terms of what God has called us to do is the best thing that we can give ourselves to. Now, that can mean all kinds of things, okay? But it's interesting that he says, this is the thing, stand firm, give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because we know that your labor is not in vain. Whatever you do will have results. Many of you are familiar with what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 6, store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. How's your bank account up there? I've tried to think about this thing of we actually can store up treasures in heaven. We don't earn our way to heaven. We don't get in by earning. But the Bible does speak all over the place about us storing up there. I don't know if this is a bit of my meanderings and wonderings, okay? Could it be, and maybe there's just one way of looking at it, that some people, I know you're going to say, nah, not quite, Hart, but just for the sake of illustration, okay? Could it be that some people in heaven will be really rich? And could it be that some people in heaven will be poor? I know you're going, That's why I said, just give me a chance here. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 says that some, and it doesn't quite use this language, but it says what I'm trying to say right now, some will get in by the skin of their teeth. Okay? Read it if you don't believe me. Some will get in by the skin of their teeth. And others, and it's talking about the very stuff we're talking about right now, others have built using gold and silver. In other words, they've built using things that last, and they get in and they've got a whole bunch there. Now, I know that we go, no, we're not getting poor. But is there such a thing as getting rewards when we get to heaven? Is there? Yeah. Jesus says it numerous times, great will be your reward in heaven. If you do this and this, great will be your reward in heaven. So what do you want? A 400 square foot apartment or 2,500 square foot really luxurious house? I know it doesn't, I know, but we tend to think it doesn't make any difference. As long as I'm saved, it makes no difference. Right? Right? As long as I get in. And honestly, I go, as long as I get in. Like, you know what I'm saying? But we have minimized this thing of working in the light of the future and realizing that we can do things today that have effect in eternity. There is a way of storing up treasure in heaven, and Jesus says, don't put all your money, energy, everything you have, don't put it all into this life. Put it into the next life. Put it into the things that really count, because it will affect the next life. It doesn't affect you getting in. We get in by the blood of Jesus Christ, by putting our faith in him, and if we believe in him, we will want to serve him. Does that make sense, or am I way off the... How many of you think I'm way off? How many of you think I'm a little bit off? Oh, okay. Just one. Any more? Somehow, he says, if we believe in our future bodily resurrection, that we will be living, we will be walking, and I don't know what that's going to look like. I don't think we're just going to be floating around in the clouds, eating Philadelphia cheese. I think we're actually going to be doing things. I think somehow what I do in this life affects that life, and somehow Jesus tries to call us to this thing of, you guys, come on, if you believe this, do something about it in the now. Live in the now, believing that. Because sometimes we're like the disciples, and we hear it, and we hear them talking about it, but do we really believe it? Or are we going to get up there one day and we get in just barely, and we go, oh, you mean you meant it? You mean you were really telling the truth? And I'm speaking to myself as much as to all of us. It's this whole thing of the disciples heard him. They heard him. They heard him. I'm going to die. This is what's going to happen. But on the third day, I'm going to be raised from the dead. And they didn't really believe it. And the same thing can be true for us where we don't really believe it. We believe it, but we don't, to the point where it totally affects how we live in the here and now. Secondly, or letter B in my outline, Jesus' resurrection results in new life. Now, the disciples' lives were drastically changed. Drastically changed. And they went from living one way and just being so dejected. And when they saw Jesus, oh my goodness, there is nothing that can stand in the way of what God wants to do. Peter, one of the disciples, one of them who was there, one of them who was not really believing it, saw Jesus resurrected. In one of the letters he writes, he says, 1 Peter 1 verse 3, in his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. I mean, he's just describing, this is what happened to us, guys. I mean, we got born again when we saw Jesus was alive. Gave us new birth into a living hope. Many of you know the story of three of Jesus' really close friends. Three siblings, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And you know the story of when Mary and Martha at one point sent word to Jesus, hey, your really close friend Lazarus is really sick. Please come quickly. And Jesus was a ways away, but he didn't make a big effort to get there really quickly. And so he finally got to where they were, and by the time he got there, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. And so Jesus goes and to where Mary and Martha are, and he talks to them. And we can't get into the whole story, but I just want to say the one thing Jesus said, among other things. Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And most of you know the story. Jesus literally raises Lazarus from the dead. But it's interesting to me that what Jesus says here, this is before Jesus died and rose again. And Jesus doesn't just say, I have this kind of power. He says to them, I am the resurrection and the life. That's who I am. That's what I contain in my very being. In other words, death cannot hold me. It never will be able to hold me. It never will be able to keep me. But what I find so interesting here is that he's saying something to them at this point. Not only that he's going to raise Lazarus, but he's wanting them to know that you can never defeat God. You can never defeat what he wants to do. You can never stand in his way. And he's saying to them, I'm the resurrection and the life, and anyone who believes in me, even though they die, they'll live, but even if they die, they're going to continue to live. In other words, I'm life. Death cannot stop whoever I put life into. And so he's making an ultimate declaration that God is never defeated. And if there's one thing that I believe he was saying to them at that point, and he'd want to say to us, if the Easter story, among all kinds of other things, if it says one other thing to us is, God is demonstrating that nothing can stop him. Where Jesus was on the cross, Jesus did die, but nothing could stop what God wanted to do. God said, Jesus said, on the third day I will rise from the dead. Nothing could stop that. And the same is true in our lives. If we have the living Christ living within us, it's not to say that we don't go through difficult times. It doesn't mean that we don't go through really hard times. It doesn't mean that those things don't even last at different times. But it does say that Jesus always gets the last word. Friday is not the end. And we will go through difficulty, we'll go through sickness, we'll go through hardship, we'll go through different things. But the cross of Christ and the tomb, the empty tomb, says to us that even when we go through the difficult times, even when we go through the hard times, we have a living hope. And even if we die, we have a living hope that he has given us life and that God will never be defeated. That God always is triumphant. And so there was a hope that Jesus wanted his disciples to have. When they saw him go through all the suffering, he told them that he's going to rise from the dead because he wanted them to have hope, but they missed it. They didn't have the hope during those 3 days. They thought it was all over. They thought it was done. And for us, if there's one thing God would want to have for us, he wants us to have hope in the present. He wants us to always have hope in him, to always have hope that he is bigger than whatever we may go through. And as we've been talking about, and it also gives us hope and life in the future. And so I just pray that as we've talked about this whole thing, that the resurrection of Jesus would actually have effect in our lives. It would actually have effect on how we live. It would have effect on what we believe. I know for me personally, the very fact that I believe that I'm going to see Jesus one day has had huge effect on how I live life today and what I do and what I give myself to and what I don't give myself to. And I know that's true of many of you, but I believe there's also ways in which God wants to heighten our awareness of that and cause us to go, man, what's important in light of that? And so it's huge cause for celebration. It's huge cause for continually letting those things shape our lives, letting those things shape what we give ourselves to in the present. Let's have the worship team come up. And I thought of doing communion at the end today, but I thought, no, you know what? I think communion's Good Friday. And today is the resurrection. And so I want us to end with resurrection. I want us to end with hey guys, this is who he is. This is what he's done for us. And so let's live in an awareness of that. Doesn't mean we don't go through difficulty. Doesn't mean we don't go through hard times. But it shapes how we respond to those times. Shapes how we view those times. He came to give us life. I don't know if there are any of you here today where you've not yet come to that place of faith, where you've not surrendered your life to him, and you go, wow, if that's who he is, I want to surrender my life to him. If he came to give me life, I want to say yes. And so if you're in that place today, I want to encourage you, either grab someone close to you, ask them to pray with you. If you'd like to come up here at the end, we'd love to pray with you. And again, if any of you like prayer for something in light of what we've talked about today, Jesus is the giver of hope. He's the giver of life. Let him give that to you today. So let's stand together, and we're going to do a song together. And we'll give you opportunity after that if any of you want to be prayed for something. We'd love to pray for you as well.